Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. We love to take these journeys into some really fascinating historical nooks and crannies, and today's episode is no exception. We're going to be diving into a conflict that often gets overlooked in the grand narratives of history, but one that has had a really profound and lasting impact.
That's right. We're talking about the Anglo-Nepalese War, also sometimes called the Nepal-British War.
Exactly. And this war, fought in the early 19th century, really shaped the destiny of modern Nepal in some really fascinating ways. So, to set the stage a little bit, we're talking about a period of significant expansion and change, both for Nepal and for the British East India Company. Nepal, under the Shah dynasty, was undergoing this process of unification, bringing together various smaller kingdoms into a more centralized and powerful state.
Yeah, and at the same time, you have the British East India Company, right? They're rapidly expanding their influence across the Indian subcontinent. So you've got these two ambitious powers kind of on a collision course in many ways.
Right. It's almost like a historical recipe for conflict, isn't it? So what were some of those key factors that really lit the fuse for this war?
Well, there are a few things that were really bubbling under the surface. First, you have the issue of territorial ambitions. Both Nepal and the British had their eyes on certain strategically important regions, especially along their shared borders. These areas were often seen as vital for trade, security, all of those things.
Right, so it's not just about lines on a map, but also about the resources, the control, the access that those territories represented.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the British East India Company's perspective on Nepal. They increasingly saw Nepal as this potential buffer state, a sort of neutral zone between their territories and other powers in the region. But at the same time, their own expansionist ambitions meant that they were constantly looking for ways to exert their influence, sometimes interfering in Nepalese affairs, which obviously caused some friction.
Right, so it's this mix of territorial disputes, economic interests, and strategic maneuvering. Not exactly a recipe for peaceful coexistence.
No, not at all. And then you have specific flashpoints, right? Things that really brought those tensions to a head, like Nepal's annexation of Kumaon and Garhwal, for instance. These regions were strategically important, and the British also had their own claims and interests there.
And then you had Nepal's relationship with the Sikh kingdom, which the British weren't exactly thrilled about. So you have this complex web of alliances and rivalries that further complicates the situation.
Right. And all of these tensions ultimately culminated in a series of diplomatic efforts to try and resolve these differences.
Yeah.
But those efforts, unfortunately, they ultimately failed to bridge the divide. And by 1814, things had escalated to the point of no return, and the war officially began.
So the stage is set. The Anglo-Nepalese War breaks out in 1814. And right off the bat, you have a pretty significant mismatch in terms of military strength, right?
Absolutely. The British had a larger, better-equipped army. They had more resources, more advanced weaponry. On paper, it looked like a pretty uneven fight.
But as we know, wars are rarely won on paper alone.
That's for sure. The Nepalese, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, they were incredibly fierce and determined fighters. And they knew how to use the terrain, the mountains and hills, to their advantage. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, which really threw the British off balance.
Right. I mean, fighting in those kinds of conditions, it's a completely different ballgame than what the British were used to.
Exactly. And one of the early battles that really illustrated the Nepalese tenacity and military skill was the Battle of Nalapani in 1814.
Yeah, Nalapani. That was a truly incredible story of resistance. Tell us about that.
So Nalapani, this small fort near present-day Dehradun, it was defended by a small Nepalese force, just a few hundred men, led by this really remarkable commander, Balabhadra Kunwar. And they held off a much larger British force for over a month.
A month? That's unbelievable.
It really is. They used the terrain, they built these clever defensive positions, and they fought with incredible bravery. It was a really costly battle for the British. It really forced them to reconsider their strategies and to recognize the fighting spirit of the Nepalese. It wasn't just a heroic stand. This battle had long-lasting repercussions. The bravery and skill of the Nepalese soldiers, especially in those difficult mountainous conditions, really impressed the British. This actually became a factor in the later recruitment of Gurkha soldiers into the British Army.
Wow, that's an incredible legacy. So this small but mighty force at Nalapani really made a huge impact.
They really did. And this pattern of fierce Nepalese resistance continued throughout the war. There were other battles, like the Siege of Pasmore, for example. There again, the Nepalese initially held off the British, but eventually had to retreat due to superior British numbers and resources.
Right. So it's this constant push and pull with the Nepalese demonstrating their military prowess, but ultimately being outmatched by the British in terms of sheer firepower and manpower.
Exactly. And that kind of leads us to another really key battle, the Battle of Jagjitpur in 1815. This one was led by a prominent Nepalese general, Bhimsen Thapa. He launched this really bold offensive, really trying to turn the tide of the war.
So they weren't just on the defensive the whole time, they were actively looking for opportunities to strike back.
Absolutely. And while the British ultimately won the battle, it again highlighted those Nepalese military tactics, their ability to adapt to the terrain and to really make the British fight for every inch of ground.
Right. It was a constant reminder that this wasn't going to be a quick and easy victory for the British.
No, not at all. But as the war dragged on, the resource disparity, the difference in manpower, it really started to take its toll on the Nepalese. By 1815, their defenses were weakening, and they were facing increasing pressure from the British.
So it's one of those classic situations where even the bravest and most skilled fighters can only hold out for so long against a larger and better equipped enemy. It's a tragic but often recurring theme in history.
Yeah, unfortunately. And ultimately, facing these mounting challenges, Nepal was forced to negotiate a peace treaty with the British. That treaty, the Treaty of Sugauli, was signed in 1816, marking the official end of the Anglo-Nepalese War.
And the terms of that treaty, as I understand it, were pretty harsh on Nepal.
They were. Nepal had to cede large chunks of territory to the British, including some really important regions like Kumaon, Garhwal, and parts of the Terai Plains, which were really valuable for agriculture. They also had to accept limitations on their foreign policy, which essentially meant they couldn't make any alliances or agreements without British approval.
Wow, so it was a really significant blow to Nepal's autonomy and territorial integrity. What a loss. So what were the long-term repercussions of this war and the Treaty of Sugauli for Nepal? How did it shape their trajectory as a nation?
Well, despite those losses, the war actually played this really interesting role in shaping Nepal's identity. It was a defining moment for them. It really solidified the idea of Nepal as an independent nation. Even though they had lost territory, they had fought fiercely for their sovereignty, they had held their own against a global power, and that really resonated with the Nepalese people.
Right. It's like that old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly. And the war also, in a way, strengthened the central authority of the Shah dynasty. They had led the resistance against the British, and that kind of helped to consolidate their power within Nepal.
So even in defeat, they found a way to kind of turn it to their advantage in some ways. It's fascinating how these historical events can have these unintended consequences.
It really is. And then you also have the impact on the British, right? They had underestimated the Nepalese. They had suffered significant losses in those early battles. And that experience, it really instilled a sense of respect for the Nepalese, for their fighting abilities, and for the challenging terrain of the region.
Right. It was a learning experience for them, albeit a bloody one.
It definitely was.
Yeah.
And that newfound respect eventually laid the groundwork for a different kind of relationship between Britain and Nepal. It eventually led to more formal diplomatic relations, although, of course, those relations were still very much shaped by the power dynamics of the time.
So a complex and multifaceted legacy, both for Nepal and for the British.
For sure. And another really important part of that legacy is the emergence of the Rana regime. The political landscape in Nepal, it was pretty unstable after the war. And that instability, it created an opportunity for powerful families like the Ranas to rise to prominence and consolidate their control over the government. And that led to over a century of Rana rule, which had a huge impact on Nepal's internal politics and development.
So it's like this ripple effect, right? The war, the treaty, the political maneuvering, all of it contributed to this major shift in Nepalese history.
Absolutely. The Anglo-Nepalese War, it might not be as well known as some other conflicts of the era, but it really had this huge and lasting impact. It shaped Nepal's borders, its political system, its national identity. It's a story of resilience, of adaptation, and of the enduring human desire for independence.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive into this fascinating chapter of history, I think it leaves us with a lot to ponder, doesn't it?
It really does.
It makes you think about the complex interplay of global forces, the consequences of ambition, and the remarkable ways in which even small nations can leave an indelible mark on history.
It's a story about those big themes, for sure.
It is, and it also makes you think about the delicate balance that all nations have to navigate between resisting external pressures and adapting to the changing realities of the world. That's a challenge that continues to resonate today, not just in Nepal, but in countless other places around the globe.
I agree, it's an ongoing challenge and a really important one to consider as we try to understand our own complex world.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the Anglo-Nepalese War. It's been a truly enlightening conversation.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure to discuss these stories.
And to all of you listening out there, we hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to explore those lesser-known corners of history that often hold such incredible insights. And as you reflect on the story of the Anglo-Nepalese War, consider how the struggle for independence, the impact of conflict, and the delicate balancing act between resistance and adaptation, how these themes continue to play out on the global stage even today. It's a thought-provoking legacy, one that we can all learn from. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.
See you then.
Bye for now.